Welcome back to another episode that will make you grateful for modern inconveniences. Tonight we're diving into one of history's most nightmarish experiences, medieval imprisonment. If you've ever complained about modern jail conditions or thought medieval dungeons looked romantically atmospheric in movies, prepare to have those notions thoroughly demolished. By the time we're done exploring the reality of medieval incarceration, you'll be kissing the ground of the 21st century and thanking whatever deity you believe in that your worst legal troubles involve traffic tickets rather than being thrown into a hole in the ground to slowly rot while rats eat your feet. Before we descend into this particular circle of historical hell, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, and let me know in the comments what other historical experiences you'd like me to traumatize you with next. Now, let's get ourselves arrested in 1347 and discover why medieval justice made modern prison systems look like luxury resorts by comparison. Your arrest. When justice comes knocking. Picture this. You're a moderately successful merchant in 14th century England, going about your business when suddenly you're accused of cheating on grain weights by a competitor who wants to eliminate your business. In medieval times, accusations didn't require much evidence, just someone important enough pointing a finger at you. Before you can properly defend yourself, you're seized by the local bailiff's men and dragged before a magistrate who's already decided you're probably guilty of something, even if it's not what you're actually accused of. The arrest process itself would be traumatic by modern standards. No Miranda rights, no right to remain silent, no phone call to a lawyer, because lawyers as we know them barely existed for common people. You're not innocent until proven guilty. You're suspicious until you can prove otherwise, and the burden of proof falls entirely on you. The medieval justice system operated on the assumption that accusations usually had some merit, especially if they came from people with social standing above yours. Your possessions are immediately seized to pay for your imprisonment, because yes, medieval prisoners had to pay for their own incarceration. This wasn't just room and board, it was protection money, bribe money, and basic survival money all rolled into one extortionate package. The jailer is essentially running a business where customers have no choice but to pay whatever he demands, creating a perfect monopoly situation that would make modern corporate villains weep with envy. As you're dragged through the streets toward the local prison, townspeople gather to watch the spectacle. Some throw rotting vegetables or stones, not out of personal animosity, but because public humiliation was considered part of the justice process. Your reputation, built over years of honest dealing, evaporates in minutes as neighbours who previously trusted you with their business now assume you must be guilty of something serious enough to warrant arrest. The walk to prison serves multiple purposes beyond simple transportation. It's public theatre designed to demonstrate that justice is being served, social control through humiliation, and a warning to others about the consequences of crossing those in power. By the time you reach the prison gates, you've already been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. The medieval concept of justice was fundamentally different from modern understanding. There was no presumption of innocence, no standard of evidence, and no protection against self-incrimination. The system operated more like organised revenge than impartial law enforcement. If someone with sufficient social standing accused you of wrongdoing, the burden was on you to prove your innocence, rather than on the accuser to prove your guilt. The social hierarchy played a crucial role in determining how arrests were conducted and who faced imprisonment. Nobles accused of crimes might be placed under house arrest in their own castles, or trusted to appear for trial based on their word alone. Wealthy merchants could often post bond or find guarantors who would vouch for their appearance. Poor people, however, went straight to prison because they lacked the social connections and financial resources that could secure alternative arrangements. Women faced particular vulnerabilities during arrest procedures. Female suspects were often subjected to searches for witch marks or other supposed evidence of supernatural activities. They might be stripped and examined for unusual moles, scars, or birthmarks that could be interpreted as signs of diabolic pacts. The invasion of privacy and dignity that accompanied female arrests was designed as much to humiliate and intimidate as to gather evidence. The timing of arrests often reflected political and economic considerations rather than the urgency of criminal justice. Authorities might delay arrests until market days when larger crowds could witness the public humiliation. Political arrests were often timed to coincide with religious festivals or royal visits to maximise their propaganda value. Economic arrests might be scheduled to coincide with harvest times when debtors would be most unable to pay their obligations. Children were not exempt from arrest and imprisonment, though the age at which they could be held criminally responsible varied by region and crime. Boys as young as 7 could be arrested for theft, while girls might face charges related to sexual behaviour or witchcraft at similarly young ages. The medieval justice system made little accommodation for childhood development or family circumstances when determining criminal responsibility. The geographic location of your arrest determined which authority would handle your case and what kind of treatment you might expect. Royal prisons were typically better maintained than local facilities, while ecclesiastical prisons operated under different rules entirely. Church courts handled moral and religious offences with procedures that that differed significantly from secular justice, though they could be equally harsh in their own ways. Welcome to Hell, your first look at medieval prison. The first thing that hits you about medieval prison isn't the sight, it's the smell. Imagine the worst public bathroom you've ever encountered, multiply that by 50, add the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste, disease, and death, then concentrate it all in an underground space with no ventilation. The odour is so overwhelming that some visitors to medieval prisons fainted before they even saw the conditions inside. Your prison isn't the stone-walled, barred-window dungeon of Hollywood imagination. It's more likely a converted basement, cellar, or purpose-built underground chamber with walls that weep moisture and floors covered in straw that hasn't been changed in months. The straw, originally intended to provide some insulation and absorb waste, has become a festering ecosystem of parasites, mould, and decomposing organic matter that squelches unpleasantly under your feet. The architecture of medieval prisons was designed for containment, not comfort or health. Windows, if they exist at all, are tiny slits near the ceiling that admit barely enough light to see during daytime and provide no meaningful ventilation. The walls are thick stone or earth, designed to prevent escape, but also ensuring that temperature remains constant year-round. Cold in winter, suffocatingly damp in summer, and always uncomfortable. Your cell, if you can call it that, is probably a shared space that houses anywhere from 5 to 20 prisoners, depending on the prison's size and current population. Personal space is non-existent. You'll be sleeping, eating, and performing all bodily functions within arm's reach of fellow prisoners who may be murderers, thieves, political prisoners, or people accused of crimes they didn't commit. The social dynamics of this forced intimacy create constant tension and occasional violence. The jailer who greets you is not a salaried government employee, but essentially a private contractor who bought his position and expects to profit from it. He views prisoners as revenue sources rather than human beings in custody, and his treatment of you depends entirely on your ability to pay for better conditions. If you have money, you might secure a spot near a wall where you can lean back. If you're broke, you'll compete for floor space in the centre, where people step on you throughout the night. Lighting comes from whatever candles or oil lamps prisoners can afford to purchase from the jailer at inflated prices. Most of the time, you'll exist in near total darkness, which creates additional psychological stress and makes basic activities like eating or avoiding other prisoners' waste extremely difficult. The darkness isn't peaceful. It's filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, crying, and occasional screams from prisoners experiencing mental breakdowns or physical crises. The ceiling of your underground prison is low enough that tall people must constantly stoop to avoid hitting their heads on stone or wooden beams. This architectural feature isn't accidental. It's designed to create physical discomfort and psychological oppression that reminds prisoners of their reduced status. The feeling of being literally crushed by the weight of the building above reinforces the hopelessness of the situation. Water infiltration is a constant problem in underground prisons, creating pools of stagnant liquid that harbour disease and make already cold conditions even more miserable. During heavy rains, some prisons actually flood, forcing prisoners to stand in knee-deep water mixed with human waste until the flooding recedes. The moisture creates mould and mildew that contribute to respiratory problems while making everything perpetually damp and clammy. The heating system, such as it exists, consists of whatever body heat prisoners can generate collectively. In winter, prisoners huddle together for warmth, which increases disease transmission but provides the only protection against hypothermia. Frostbite and death from exposure are common during particularly cold periods, especially among prisoners who are already weakened by malnutrition or disease. Ventilation is virtually non-existent, creating an atmosphere that's constantly thick with the breath, body odour, and waste products of multiple people confined in a small space. The air quality is so poor that candle flames flicker and sometimes extinguish due to lack of oxygen. Prisoners regularly faint from the combination of poor air quality, malnutrition, and physical stress, creating additional medical emergencies in an environment with no medical care. The structural integrity of medieval prisons was often questionable, with buildings constructed quickly and cheaply rather than to last. Walls might crack or collapse, creating both escape opportunities and burial hazards for prisoners. The underground location made structural problems particularly dangerous, as cave-ins could trap or kill prisoners with no possibility of rescue. Storage of personal possessions was impossible in the crowded conditions, meaning that anything you brought to prison would likely be stolen by fellow prisoners or confiscated by guards. The few belongings that prisoners managed to keep had to be carried on their bodies at all times, creating additional discomfort and marking valuable items for theft. The absence of secure storage eliminated any possibility of maintaining dignity through personal grooming or clean clothing. The economics of survival, pay or die. Medieval imprisonment operated on a simple principle. Everything costs money, and if you don't have money, you suffer until you die. The jailer's income came entirely from extracting payment from prisoners and their families, creating a system where poverty was literally a death sentence and wealth could buy relative comfort even in the worst conditions. Your daily survival depends on a complex pricing system that would make modern healthcare billing seem straightforward by comparison. Food costs money, not just to obtain, but to receive edible portions rather than scraps that wouldn't be fed to animals. Water costs money, especially clean water that won't immediately give you dysentery. Space costs money, the difference between sleeping in a dry corner versus a wet central area where other prisoners urinate. Protection costs money, both from the jailer and from other prisoners who might rob or assault you. The food situation exemplifies the prison's economic exploitation. The jailer provides a basic ration that technically keeps prisoners alive, but is deliberately made as unpalatable and insufficient as possible to encourage additional purchases. Your daily bread is likely mouldy, your porridge watery and gritty, your occasional piece of meat either spoiled or so tough it's inedible. If you want food that won't make you immediately sick, you pay extra. If you want enough food to maintain your strength, you pay much extra. Clean drinking water represents another crucial expense. The basic prison ration consists of whatever water is cheapest for the jailer to obtain, often from contaminated sources that spread disease throughout the prison population. Clean water, drawn from better sources or boiled to reduce contamination, costs significantly more but represents the difference between probable death from waterborne illness and possible survival long enough to face trial. Personal hygiene becomes an expensive luxury when everything requires payment. A bowl to wash your face costs money, soap costs money, clean straw for bedding costs money, a chamber pot costs money, and without one, you'll be relieving yourself in whatever corner seems least offensive to your cellmates until they decide they've had enough of your presence and take matters into their own hands. Medical care, such as it exists, follows the same economic principles. If you become seriously ill or injured, the jailer might summon a local physician or apothecary, but their services require payment in advance. Without money, you'll depend on whatever folk remedies your fellow prisoners might know, assuming they're willing to share their knowledge with someone who can't reciprocate with payment or favours. The prison's economic system extends beyond immediate survival to longer-term strategy. Wealthy prisoners could purchase private cells, better food, writing materials to maintain correspondence with the outside world, and even permission for visitors. Some could essentially buy house arrest, remaining in the prison but with conditions that resemble boarding at an unpleasant inn, rather than incarceration in a dungeon. Your family's response to your imprisonment becomes crucial for survival. They need to provide regular payments for your basic needs, while also saving money for bribes, legal fees, and the various costs associated with defending your case. Many families bankrupted themselves trying to keep imprisoned relatives alive long enough for trial, often succeeding only in impoverishing themselves while delaying rather than preventing death. The jailer's profit motive created perverse incentives that made prisoners' lives unnecessarily miserable. He had no reason to maintain sanitary conditions, prevent disease, or provide adequate food unless prisoners paid extra for these basic human needs. Dead prisoners paid no fees, but neither did they require resources. So the jailer's optimal strategy involved keeping prisoners just healthy enough to continue generating revenue while providing minimum possible amenities. Legal fees represented another major expense that many prisoners couldn't afford. While formal legal representation was limited, scribes were needed to prepare documents, witnesses required payment for testimony, and court officials expected bribes for favourable treatment. The legal process itself became a series of financial transactions, where justice went to the highest bidder. Bribery was so integral to the prison system that it operated almost like a formal fee structure. Guards could be bribed to deliver messages, provide better food, allow longer visits, or look the other way during escape attempts. The jailer could be bribed to provide better accommodations, medical care, or protection from other prisoners. Even fellow prisoners operated informal bribery systems where favours, information, and protection were traded for money or goods. The seasonal variation in prison costs reflected broader economic patterns in medieval society. During harvest times, when food was plentiful, prison food costs might decrease slightly. During winter months, when fuel was expensive, heating costs increased dramatically. Religious festivals might bring charitable donations that temporarily improve conditions, while political upheavals could cause costs to spike as demand for prison services increased. Debt imprisonment created particularly cruel economic cycles where people were imprisoned for owing money but couldn't earn money to pay their debts while imprisoned. These debtors often spent years in prison, accumulating additional costs for their incarceration while their original debts continued to grow with interest. Some families sold everything they owned to pay for imprisoned relatives' survival, only to see those relatives die anyway after the family had been completely impoverished. The inheritance inheritance implications of imprisonment were severe, as convicted criminals often forfeited their property to the Crown or local authorities. This meant that families not only lost their primary breadwinner, but also lost their homes, businesses, and other assets that might have supported them. The economic consequences of imprisonment extended far beyond the individual prisoner to affect entire extended families and business partnerships. Women's economic situations in prison were particularly precarious because they typically had less control over family finances and fewer independent income sources. Female prisoners often depended entirely on male relatives for financial support, creating additional vulnerability if those relatives were unwilling or unable to provide adequate funds. Some women resorted to sexual favours to obtain better treatment or basic necessities, further degrading their circumstances. The regional variation in prison costs reflected local economic conditions and the wealth of typical prisoners. Urban prisons in commercial centres might have higher costs, but also more opportunities for prisoner families to earn money for support. Rural prisons might be cheaper, but also more isolated from family networks that could provide financial assistance. The economics of survival varied dramatically based on location and local conditions. Your fellow prisoners, a forced community of desperation. Medieval prisons housed everyone together regardless of their alleged crimes, social status, or likelihood of guilt. Your cellmates might include accused murderers, thieves, political prisoners, debtors, religious dissidents, and people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when someone needed a scapegoat. This forced coexistence created complex social dynamics that could mean the difference between survival and death. The social hierarchy within prison walls bore little resemblance to outside society. Wealth remained important. Rich prisoners could still buy better treatment and protection, but physical strength, criminal experience, and psychological intimidation became equally valuable currencies. The minor noble imprisoned for political reasons might find himself subordinate to the career criminal who understood prison survival tactics better than court etiquette. Violence was a constant possibility in this environment. Overcrowding meant that personal conflicts couldn't be avoided through distance or time. Competition for limited resources, better sleeping spots, cleaner food, protection from guards, created ongoing tension that could explode into fights over seemingly trivial issues. A cough that kept others awake, an inadvertent elbow during sleep, or a dispute over food distribution could escalate into violence that left someone permanently injured or dead. The absence of privacy eliminated normal social boundaries and forced intimacy that bred both solidarity and hostility. You'd witness fellow prisoners' most vulnerable moments, breakdowns over family separation, physical illness, religious crises, or simple fear of execution. Some prisoners developed genuine supportive relationships based on shared suffering, while others became predatory, viewing cellmates' weaknesses as opportunities for exploitation. Mental illness was common in medieval prisons, both among those who arrived with existing conditions and those who developed psychological problems due to the stress of incarceration. Prisoners experiencing hallucinations, violent outbursts, or complete withdrawal created additional dangers and complications for everyone sharing the space. With no understanding of mental health treatment, fellow prisoners often responded to psychological disturbance with either cruel mockery or violent suppression. The turnover rate in medieval prisons was high due to executions, deaths from disease, and occasional releases, meaning that social dynamics constantly shifted as new prisoners arrived and others disappeared. Establishing trust or friendship required constant readjustment as people you'd grown to depend on were suddenly removed from the environment, often permanently. Communication with the outside world represented both hope and frustration for prisoners. Those with literate family members might receive occasional letters, but only if they could pay the jailer's fees for accepting and delivering correspondence. Illiterate prisoners depended on others to read and write letters for them, creating complex debts and dependencies within the prison community. Religious observance provided both comfort and conflict among prisoners. Some found solace in prayer and religious ceremony, while others rejected faith entirely in response to their circumstances. Religious differences that seemed minor in free society became magnified in prison, where competing interpretations of divine justice, proper behaviour, and spiritual meaning created ongoing debates and occasional violence. The seasonal prisoner population fluctuated based on agricultural cycles, political events, and religious calendars. Harvest time might bring debtors and petty criminals, while political upheavals could flood prisons with suspected dissidents. Religious festivals might prompt either mass releases through royal pardons or increased arrests of religious minorities, changing the character and dynamics of the prison population unpredictably. Theft among prisoners was endemic, with new arrivals being particularly vulnerable to having their possessions stolen by more experienced inmates. Veterans of the prison system developed elaborate methods for concealing valuables and protecting their few belongings from fellow prisoners who viewed newcomers as opportunities for enrichment. The constant threat of theft created additional stress and paranoia in an already hostile environment. Sexual violence among male prisoners was common but rarely discussed in historical records. The isolation of prisons, the absence of oversight, and the presence of violent violent criminals created conditions where sexual assault could occur with impunity. Younger, weaker, or wealthier prisoners were particularly vulnerable to sexual predation by cellmates who used rape as a form of domination and intimidation. The ethnic and regional diversity of prison populations reflected the cosmopolitan nature of medieval society, particularly in major trading centres. French prisoners might share cells with English, Italian, German, or Jewish inmates, creating communication barriers and cultural conflicts that added another layer of complexity to prison social dynamics. Ethnic tensions from the outside world often intensified in the confined prison environment. Professional criminals formed informal networks within prisons, sharing information about criminal techniques, potential targets, and corrupt officials who could be bribed. These criminal universities provided education in illegal activities while creating social bonds that continued after release, assuming the participants survived their imprisonment. The concentration of criminals in prisons facilitated the development of more sophisticated criminal organizations. Political prisoners often faced particular hostility from common criminals who viewed them as privileged individuals deserving of their downfall. However, political prisoners sometimes had better connections to outside support networks and might be able to provide benefits to fellow inmates through their family connections or political influence. These complex dynamics created shifting alliances based on immediate needs rather than ideological sympathy. Elderly prisoners faced special challenges in the harsh prison environment, often depending on younger inmates for physical assistance with basic needs. Some older prisoners provided wisdom, mediation services, or storytelling that earned them respect and protection from fellow inmates. Others became burdens that other prisoners resented, leading to neglect or abuse of vulnerable elderly people who couldn't defend themselves. Children imprisoned with adults faced horrific exploitation and abuse, with no protection from predatory adults who viewed them as easy victims. The few historical records of children in adult prisons describe sexual abuse, forced labour, and other forms of exploitation that would be considered intolerable even by medieval standards. The absence of separate facilities for juvenile offenders created situations where children were exposed to the worst aspects of criminal behaviour. The information economy within prisons was crucial for survival, with news from the outside world, legal developments, and gossip about guards or officials being traded as valuable commodities. Prisoners who could provide useful information might receive protection or favours from others who needed that knowledge for their own survival strategies. The circulation of rumours and misinformation also created additional anxiety and confusion in an already stressful environment. Daily life, survival in slow motion. A typical day in medieval prison begins before dawn, not by choice, but because sleep becomes impossible when you're cold, hungry, cramped, and surrounded by other people's bodily functions. The straw beneath you, which started as bedding, has become a soggy mass that provides no cushioning and harbours parasites that bite throughout the night. You wake up with new flea bites, muscle cramps from sleeping on a hard surface, and the immediate awareness that today will be exactly as miserable as yesterday. The morning routine, if it can be called that, begins with assessing what, if anything, the night's activities have changed in your environment. Perhaps someone died during the night, not uncommon given the conditions, and their body needs to be moved before decomposition makes the space even more unpleasant. Perhaps someone became violently ill and needs help cleaning up, or perhaps they were robbed by fellow prisoners and you need to recalculate the shifting alliances and dangers within your confined community. Breakfast, when available, consists of whatever the jailer provides as basic ration. This might be a piece of stale bread, a bowl of thin porridge made from the cheapest available grain, or occasionally some form of broth that's more water than nutrition. The food is distributed with minimal ceremony and maximum efficiency. Prisoners crowd around whoever has the day's rations, and those who don't assert themselves quickly may find themselves with smaller portions or none at all. The absence of scheduled activities means that time passes with excruciating slowness. Modern people accustomed to constant stimulation would find the endless hours of enforced idleness psychologically torturous. With no books, games, organised work or entertainment, prisoners must create their own mental activities or face the growing madness that accompanies sensory deprivation and social isolation, despite being constantly surrounded by other people. Conversation becomes both recreation and survival tool. Prisoners share stories about their alleged crimes, their families, their hopes for release, and their theories about what's happening in the outside world. These discussions serve multiple purposes. They pass time, maintain mental engagement, build social relationships that might prove protective, and provide information that could be useful for planning escapes or defending against charges. The midday period often brings the day's main meal, if there is one, and possibly news from the outside world through visitors, new prisoners, or guards. Information becomes a valuable commodity. News about political developments that might affect trials, reports about family members, updates about legal proceedings, or rumours about potential releases or executions. Prisoners develop complex networks for gathering and sharing information that could affect their survival chances. Afternoon and evening blend together in the windowless environment where time loses normal meaning. Some prisoners attempt to maintain routines that provide psychological structure, regular prayers, exercise within the limited space, mental rehearsal of legal defences, or planning for life after release. Others sink into despair or madness, requiring care or management from fellow prisoners who have their own survival to worry about. The evening brings its own challenges as everyone settles into whatever sleeping arrangements they can manage within the shared space. Competition for better spots creates tension, while the sounds and smells of people sleeping in unhygienic conditions prevent restful sleep. Night brings vulnerability to theft, assault, or worse from fellow prisoners, requiring constant vigilance even during supposed rest periods. Personal hygiene becomes increasingly difficult as imprisonment continues. Without regular access to clean water, soap, or washing facilities, prisoners develop skin conditions, dental problems, and parasitic infestations that add physical misery to psychological suffering. The deterioration of personal cleanliness affects not just individual health but group dynamics, as increasingly filthy prisoners become offensive to cellmates who must share the confined space. Exercise opportunities are virtually non-existent in the cramped conditions, leading to muscle atrophy, joint problems, and general physical deterioration. Prisoners who attempt to maintain fitness through calisthenics or movement within the limited space may be viewed as disruptive by others trying to rest or sleep. The physical decline that accompanies imprisonment makes prisoners less able to defend themselves and more vulnerable to disease and violence. The bathroom situation represents one of the most degrading aspects of daily life in medieval prisons. Chamber pots, if available, must be shared among multiple prisoners and are emptied irregularly, depending on the jailer's convenience and prisoners' ability to pay for the service. Without adequate facilities, prisoners are forced to relieve themselves in corners of the cell, creating sanitation problems that contribute to disease transmission and psychological demoralization. Laundry is impossible under normal circumstances, meaning that prisoners wear the same clothes for months or years until they literally fall apart. The accumulation of dirt, sweat, urine, feces, and other bodily fluids creates clothing that becomes as much a source of disease and discomfort as protection. Some prisoners might be able to purchase replacement clothing from guards or have family members provide clean garments, but most endure progressive deterioration of their personal appearance and hygiene. Entertainment, such as it exists, comes from whatever prisoners can create through conversation, storytelling, singing, or crude games using improvised materials. Gambling with stones, sticks, or other found objects provides diversion, but also creates additional conflict when prisoners dispute outcomes or fail to pay gambling debts. The absence of external entertainment makes these simple activities crucial for psychological survival. Meal preparation and distribution become daily sources of conflict and negotiation among prisoners. The inadequate food supplies must be divided somehow, creating opportunities for both cooperation and exploitation. Stronger prisoners might claim larger portions through intimidation, while clever prisoners might trade services or information for better access to food. The politics of food distribution reflect broader power dynamics within the prison community. Sleep deprivation is chronic due to the uncomfortable conditions, noise from other prisoners, anxiety about security, and physical discomfort from sleeping on hard surfaces. The constant fatigue makes prisoners more vulnerable to disease, less able to think clearly about legal defences or survival strategies, and more susceptible to psychological breakdown. The cumulative effects of sleep deprivation can be as damaging as malnutrition or disease. Temperature regulation is impossible in the unheated prison environment, where prisoners face extremes of cold in winter and stifling conditions in summer. Without adequate clothing or bedding, prisoners must rely on shared body heat for warmth, which increases disease transmission but provides the only protection against hypothermia. The constant physical discomfort from temperature extremes adds another layer of misery to the daily struggle for survival. Medical nightmares, disease, and death. Medieval prisons were essentially disease incubators, designed by accident to create optimal conditions for every possible form of illness to flourish and spread rapidly through the captive population. The combination of overcrowding, poor sanitation, malnutrition, contaminated water, lack of ventilation, and stress created a perfect storm of medical disasters that killed more prisoners than executions ever did. Respiratory diseases spread like wildfire in the close quarters of medieval prisons. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and various forms of lung fever passed easily from person to person through coughing, sneezing, and simply breathing the same stagnant air. Once respiratory illness took hold in a prison, it typically infected most of the population within weeks. The mortality rate was catastrophic, but those who survived often suffered permanent lung damage that left them weakened for life. Dysentery and other intestinal diseases were equally devastating and even more unpleasant than respiratory illness. Contaminated water, spoiled food, and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for waterborne pathogens that caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and death. Prisoners suffering from dysentery couldn't control their bowel movements, creating additional sanitation problems that increased disease transmission throughout the confined space. Skin conditions flourished in the filthy environment where personal hygiene was nearly impossible. Scabies, caused by parasitic mites burrowing under the skin, created intense itching that drove prisoners to scratch themselves bloody. Lice infestations covered scalps and bodies, carrying typhus and other diseases while causing constant discomfort. Open wounds, cuts, and scratches became infected readily in the dirty environment, sometimes leading to gangrene and death from what started as minor injuries. Malnutrition weakened prisoners' immune systems and made them vulnerable to diseases they might otherwise survive. The inadequate prison diet lacked essential nutrients, leading to scurvy, rickets, and other deficiency diseases that compounded the effects of infectious illness. Malnourished prisoners took longer to recover from disease, experienced more severe symptoms, and were more likely to develop complications that proved fatal. Mental illness, while not understood in modern terms, was clearly recognized as a common consequence of medieval imprisonment. The stress of uncertain legal proceedings, separation from family, physical suffering, and constant threat of death drove many prisoners into what would now be recognized as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress. Some prisoners experienced complete psychological breaks, becoming violent, catatonic, or delusional. Medical treatment for sick prisoners was minimal and usually ineffective by modern standards. Prison authorities might summon a local physician or apothecary if prisoners could pay for treatment, but medieval medicine had limited understanding of disease causes and few effective treatments. Bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies were the standard approaches to illness, often making patients worse rather than better. The concept of quarantine was unknown in medieval prisons, so sick prisoners remained with the general population, continuing to spread disease until they either recovered or died. Dead prisoners might remain in the cell for days before removal, especially if their families couldn't pay for prompt body disposal. The presence of corpses accelerated disease transmission and added psychological trauma to an already hellish environment. Childbirth in medieval prisons was particularly horrific for the women unfortunate enough to be pregnant when arrested. With no medical care, unsanitary conditions, and inadequate nutrition, maternal and infant mortality rates approached 100%. Women who survived childbirth often faced the additional trauma of watching their newborns die from exposure, malnutrition, or disease within days or weeks of birth. The seasonal variation in prison disease patterns followed predictable cycles that prisoners learned to fear. Winter brought respiratory diseases that flourished in cold, damp conditions. Spring brought renewed outbreaks as melting snow contaminated water sources. Summer intensified gastrointestinal diseases as heat spoiled food and concentrated odours. Autumn brought harvest-related arrests that overcrowded prisons just as cold weather approached. Pain management in medieval prisons was essentially non-existent. Prisoners suffering from injuries, chronic conditions, or disease symptoms had no access to effective pain relief beyond whatever alcohol they could afford to purchase from guards. Many prisoners developed dependencies on alcohol as the only available escape from physical and psychological suffering, creating additional health problems in an already devastating environment. Dental problems were universal among long-term prisoners due to poor nutrition and lack of oral hygiene. Tooth decay, gum disease, and dental abscesses caused constant pain and sometimes led to life-threatening infections. The inability to chew food properly due to dental problems contributed to malnutrition and digestive issues. Some prisoners resorted to pulling their own infected teeth using crude tools, often causing additional injury and infection. Eye problems were common due to the constant darkness, poor air quality, and nutritional deficiencies. Many prisoners developed night blindness, cataracts, or infections that could lead to permanent vision loss. The psychological impact of losing sight in an already dangerous environment was devastating, making prisoners completely dependent on others for basic survival. Parasitic infections were endemic in medieval prisons, with various worms, flukes, and other parasites finding ideal conditions in the unsanitary environment. Intestinal parasites caused malnutrition and digestive problems, while external parasites like lice and fleas transmitted diseases and caused caused constant discomfort. The treatment of parasitic infections was limited to crude folk remedies that were rarely effective. Injuries from violence, accidents, or suicide attempts were common, but received minimal medical attention. Broken bones might be set crudely if at all, leading to permanent disability. Knife wounds or other injuries became infected easily in the dirty environment, often leading to death from sepsis. The lack of medical knowledge about infection control meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening. The psychological component of illness was significant in the prison environment, where stress, despair, and trauma could manifest as physical symptoms. Prisoners often developed psychosomatic illnesses that were real, but had psychological rather than purely physical causes. The isolation, fear, and hopelessness of imprisonment could literally make people sick, creating additional medical problems in an environment with no mental health treatment. Epidemics swept through medieval prisons with devastating regularity, killing large percentages of the prisoner population within weeks or months. Plague outbreaks were particularly feared, but influenza, typhus, and other infectious diseases could be equally deadly in the confined prison environment. These epidemics often led to mass graves and temporary closures of prisons that couldn't handle the mortality rates. The diet-related diseases that affected prisoners included not just malnutrition, but specific deficiency conditions like scurvy from lack of vitamin C, pellagra from niacin deficiency, and beriberi from thiamine deficiency. These conditions caused a range of symptoms from skin problems and dental issues to neurological problems and heart failure. The monotonous prison diet of bread and gruel couldn't provide the nutritional variety needed for health. The psychology of despair, mental survival. The psychological toll of medieval imprisonment was often more devastating than the physical hardships, creating mental anguish that drove many prisoners to madness or suicide before disease or execution could claim them. The uncertainty of legal proceedings, separation from family, loss of social status, and constant threat of death created a perfect storm of psychological stresses that few people could endure without permanent mental damage. The initial shock of arrest and imprisonment was traumatic enough to break many people's spirits immediately. One day you're a free person with family, property, and social standing. The next day you're thrown into a hole with criminals and left to rot while your reputation and livelihood disappear. The speed and totality of this transformation overwhelmed many prisoners' ability to psychologically adapt, leading to immediate mental breakdown or gradual descent into despair. The uncertainty of legal proceedings created ongoing psychological torture that was often worse than knowing a definite fate. Trials could be delayed for months or years, during which prisoners lived in constant anxiety about their eventual punishment. Would they be executed, mutilated, released? The not knowing ate away at mental stability day by day, as prisoners oscillated between hope and despair without resolution. Separation from family members was particularly devastating in a society where extended family networks provided economic security, social identity, and emotional support. Imprisoned parents worried constantly about children who might be starving without their income. Imprisoned children wondered if they'd ever see their families again. Spouses faced the choice between abandoning their imprisoned partners or impoverishing themselves trying to provide support. The loss of social status and reputation affected prisoners' sense of personal identity in profound ways. Medieval society was organized around clear social hierarchies and community roles that defined people's understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Imprisonment stripped away these identities, leaving people with no clear sense of who they were or where they belonged in society. The constant threat of violence from fellow prisoners created chronic stress that prevented psychological adaptation to the environment. You couldn't relax, couldn't trust, couldn't feel safe even during sleep. This hypervigilance exhausted mental resources and made it impossible to develop coping strategies that might help with long-term survival. Every day brought new potential threats from people you couldn't avoid. The absence of privacy eliminated the psychological space that people need for processing traumatic experiences and maintaining mental health. Every emotion, every breakdown, every moment of vulnerability was witnessed by cellmates who might use that information against you. There was no place to grieve, to think, to recover mentally from the constant stress of survival in a hostile environment. Religious faith provided comfort for some prisoners, but created additional torment for others. Those who maintained belief in divine justice struggled to understand why God would permit their suffering if they were innocent. Those who lost faith faced the additional trauma of spiritual crisis on top of their legal and social problems. Religious differences among prisoners created conflicts that added to the psychological stress of the environment. The seasonal cycles of hope and despair followed the rhythm of legal proceedings, royal visits, and religious holidays. Prisoners' hopes would rise with rumours of royal pardons, general amnesties, or legal reforms, only to be crushed when these possibilities failed to materialise. The emotional rollercoaster of raised and dashed expectations was almost as torturous as constant despair. The breakdown of normal social relationships within prison created additional psychological stress. Prisoners had to navigate complex complex alliances, hierarchies, and conflicts with people they would never choose to associate with under normal circumstances. The social skills that worked in free society often proved counterproductive in prison, requiring psychological adaptation that was difficult and sometimes impossible. The gradual deterioration of personal hygiene and physical health affected prisoners' self-image and dignity in ways that compounded psychological suffering. People accustomed to maintaining certain standards of cleanliness and appearance found themselves becoming the kind of filthy, diseased beggars they might previously have scorned. This loss of dignity was particularly devastating for prisoners from higher social classes. Time distortion was another psychological challenge in an environment where days blended together without meaningful markers or progress toward resolution. Prisoners lost track of dates, seasons, and the passage of time, which created disorientation and made it difficult to maintain hope for future release. The endless present of suffering without clear duration became its own form of torture. Hallucinations and delusions were common among prisoners, partly due to malnutrition and disease, but also from the psychological stress of imprisonment. Some prisoners reported seeing deceased family members, divine figures, or demonic apparitions. Others developed paranoid delusions about fellow prisoners, guards, or outside conspiracies. These psychological symptoms made survival even more difficult and created additional dangers for other prisoners. The guilt and shame associated with imprisonment affected even innocent prisoners, as the social stigma of criminal charges could be internalized regardless of actual guilt. Many prisoners began to believe they must deserve their suffering somehow, leading to self-hatred and depression that made survival less likely. The psychological impact of false accusations could be as devastating as the impact on actually guilty prisoners. Sleep disorders were universal among medieval prisoners due to the combination of uncomfortable conditions, anxiety, and traumatic stress. Insomnia made psychological problems worse while reducing the mental resources needed for coping with daily challenges. Nightmares and night terrors were common, often featuring themes of execution, violence, or pursuit that reflected prisoners' daily fears and traumas. Memory problems developed among long-term prisoners, partly due to malnutrition and trauma, but also as a psychological defense mechanism. Some prisoners forgot details about their lives before imprisonment, while others became obsessively focused on particular memories that they rehearsed constantly. The deterioration of memory made it harder to maintain personal identity and plan for potential release. Emotional regulation became nearly impossible in the high-stress prison environment. Prisoners might cycle rapidly between rage, despair, hope, and terror without being able to control these emotional swings. The inability to regulate emotions made social relationships more difficult and increased the risk of violence or other destructive behaviors. The emotional volatility of prison life created additional dangers for everyone in the confined space. Communication problems developed as psychological stress affected prisoners' ability to express themselves clearly or understand others. Some prisoners became increasingly withdrawn and uncommunicative, while others became compulsively talkative or developed speech patterns that other prisoners found irritating or threatening. The breakdown of normal communication made survival strategies and social alliances more difficult to maintain. Cognitive decline was visible among prisoners who spent extended periods in medieval prisons, as the combination of malnutrition, disease, stress, and lack of mental stimulation took its toll on intellectual functioning. Problem-solving abilities deteriorated, making it harder to plan escapes, defend against charges, or navigate the complex social dynamics of prison life. The intellectual decline created additional vulnerability in an already dangerous environment. Escape attempts, desperation, and ingenuity. Medieval prisoners regularly attempted escapes despite the harsh punishments that awaited those who were recaptured. The desperation of their circumstances made even slim chances of freedom seem worth the enormous risks involved. Escape attempts required careful planning, physical courage, and often the cooperation of multiple prisoners, guards, or outside accomplices. The physical challenges of escaping medieval prisons were enormous. Most were built specifically to prevent escape, with thick stone walls, minimal windows, heavy doors, and often underground construction that eliminated many escape routes. Digging through walls or floors required tools that prisoners rarely possessed and time to work without detection. The construction was deliberately over-engineered to make escape nearly impossible. Successful escapes usually required inside help from guards who could be bribed to look the other way, provide tools, or even actively assist in escape plans. However, corrupting guards was expensive and dangerous. If the guard took your money but didn't follow through, you'd lost your resources and revealed your intentions. If the guard helped but you were recaptured, both prisoner and guard faced severe punishment. The timing of escape attempts was crucial and usually coordinated with external events that might provide distraction or opportunity. Religious festivals, market days, political upheavals, or natural disasters could create confusion that enabled escape attempts. Some prisoners waited for seasonal weather patterns, winter storms or summer heat waves that might affect guard routines or create cover for escape. Group escapes were more common than individual attempts because they required less individual skill while providing more collective resources and capabilities. Multiple prisoners could combine their money for bribes, their knowledge for planning, and their strength for overcoming physical obstacles. However, group escapes also increased the chances of discovery and made coordination more difficult. The tools needed for escape attempts had to be improvised from available materials or smuggled in through visitors or corrupted guards. Prisoners fashioned digging implements from eating utensils, pried mortar from walls using improvised tools, or created ropes from torn clothing and bedding. The ingenuity required was remarkable, but so was the risk of discovery during preparation phases that could last months. Disguises were sometimes attempted by prisoners who could obtain clothing that might allow them to walk out of prison dressed as guards, visitors, or officials. This required detailed knowledge of prison routines and the cooperation of people who could provide appropriate clothing. The risk was enormous. Discovery meant immediate punishment, usually execution, for everyone involved. The geography around medieval prisons affected escape planning and success rates. Prisons in cities offered better chances of blending into crowds after escape, but also had better organised pursuit systems. Rural prisons might be easier to escape from, but offered fewer places to hide and less support from sympathetic populations. Rivers, forests, and mountains all presented both opportunities and obstacles for escaping prisoners. Recapture was common and usually resulted in much worse treatment than the original imprisonment. Escaped prisoners who were caught faced immediate execution, mutilation, or placement in even more secure and unpleasant detention. The punishments were deliberately harsh to discourage other prisoners from attempting escape and to satisfy public demand for justice against those who defied the legal system. Some escape attempts succeeded in the short term, but failed in the long term because escaped prisoners couldn't establish new identities or sustainable livelihoods. Without documentation, social connections, or legitimate means of support, escaped prisoners often turned to banditry or other crimes that eventually led to recapture and worse punishment than their original charges would have warranted. The psychological impact of failed escape attempts was devastating for prisoners who had invested hope, resources, and effort in plans that came to nothing. The despair following a failed escape often destroyed prisoners' will to continue fighting for survival, leading to depression, illness, or suicide. Successful escapes inspired other prisoners, but also led to increased security measures that made future attempts more difficult. Tunnel digging was one of the most common escape methods, though it required enormous effort and time. Prisoners would slowly excavate tunnels using improvised tools, hiding the excavated dirt and covering their work to avoid detection. Most tunnel attempts failed due to cave-ins, discovery by guards, or simply the enormous physical challenge of digging through hard earth or stone foundations. Climbing escapes were attempted from windows or through openings in ceilings, using ropes made from braided clothing or bedding. These attempts were extremely dangerous due to the height of prison walls and the weakness of improvised climbing materials. Many prisoners were injured or killed attempting climbing escapes, while others were caught in the act and severely punished. Identity switching was occasionally attempted when prisoners with similar physical characteristics collaborated to have one person take another's identity for purposes of release or transfer. This required careful coordination and usually only worked when prison record-keeping was particularly sloppy or when guards could be bribed to participate in the deception. Violence against guards was sometimes used in escape attempts, though this was extremely risky given that guards were usually better armed and trained for combat than prisoners. Prisoners might overpower guards during food delivery or other routine activities, but such attempts usually failed due to the guards' preparation for potential violence and the prisoner's weakened physical condition. Feigning death was attempted by some prisoners who hoped to be removed from the prison for burial and then escape during transport. This required convincing acting abilities and often the cooperation of outside accomplices who could arrange for resurrection after apparent death. Most such attempts failed because prison authorities were aware of this strategy and took precautions to verify actual death. Bribing officials outside the prison was sometimes more effective than attempting physical escape. Wealthy prisoners might arrange for their cases to be transferred to different jurisdictions, for evidence to disappear, or for favourable testimony to be provided by witnesses. These legal escapes were expensive, but often more reliable than physical attempts to break out of prison. The legal system, justice medieval style. The legal proceedings that determined prisoners' fates were often more terrifying than the imprisonment itself, combining arbitrary authority with procedures designed to extract confessions rather than determine truth. Medieval justice operated on assumptions and methods that would horrify modern legal systems, creating a judicial process where guilt was presumed and innocence nearly impossible to prove. Your trial, if you were fortunate enough to receive one, might not occur for months or years after your arrest. The delay wasn't due to careful legal preparation, but to the convenience of judges, the availability of officials, and the payment of fees required to move your case forward. During this waiting period, you remained in prison at your own expense, gradually depleting whatever resources resources might be used for your defense. The concept of legal representation was largely non-existent for common prisoners. Wealthy individuals might hire educated men to speak on their behalf, but most prisoners faced their accusers and judges alone, without legal training or knowledge of procedures that might help their cases. The legal system was designed by and for educated elites who understood its intricacies, leaving ordinary people at severe disadvantage. Evidence standards were dramatically different from modern expectations. Accusations by people of higher social status carried more weight than denials by those of lower status. Character witnesses mattered, but only if they were socially prominent enough to risk associating with accused criminals. Physical evidence was less important than reputation, social connections, and the perceived likelihood that someone of your social class would commit the alleged crime. Torture was not only legal, but considered essential for obtaining reliable confessions in serious cases. The logic was that people would lie to avoid punishment, but they would tell the truth to avoid torture. This reasoning led to systematic use of physical coercion that would extract confessions from innocent and guilty alike, making torture a tool for confirming predetermined guilt rather than discovering truth. The specific torture methods varied by region and crime, but consistently involved excruciating pain designed to break psychological resistance while keeping prisoners alive long enough to confess. The rack stretched prisoners' joints beyond endurance. The strappado dislocated shoulders, hot irons burned flesh, thumbscrews crushed fingers. The psychological anticipation of these procedures often proved as effective as their application. Trial by ordeal, while declining by the later medieval period, still influenced legal thinking about divine intervention in human justice. The assumption was that God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty through supernatural means, relieving human judges of responsibility for errors. This created a legal system where random chance or physical endurance were interpreted as divine judgment about guilt or innocence. Confession was considered the highest form of evidence and could override all other considerations in determining guilt. This created enormous pressure on prisoners to confess, regardless of their actual guilt, because confession offered the possibility of mercy, while continued denial guaranteed harsh punishment. The legal system incentivized false confessions while treating them as reliable evidence of guilt. The death penalty was applied broadly to crimes that modern systems would consider relatively minor. Theft of goods worth more than a few shillings could result in execution, as could adultery, heresy, treason, or various forms of assault. The widespread use of capital punishment meant that many prisoners faced the possibility of death for crimes that wouldn't warrant imprisonment in contemporary justice systems. Social status profoundly affected legal outcomes in ways that were openly acknowledged rather than hidden. Nobles faced different courts, different procedures, and different punishments than commoners for identical crimes. Clergy claimed benefit of clergy that exempted them from secular courts entirely. Wealthy merchants could often pay fines instead of facing physical punishment or death for crimes that would result in execution for poor defendants. The appeals process was limited and expensive, requiring connections and resources that most prisoners lacked. Higher courts might review cases, but usually only if significant political or economic interests were involved. For ordinary prisoners, the initial trial was typically final, regardless of obvious errors in procedure or evidence that might exonerate them. Punishment alternatives to execution were often worse than death itself. Mutilation was common for theft, cutting off hands or fingers, removing eyes or ears, cutting out tongues for perjury. These punishments left survivors marked for life as convicted criminals, unable to earn livings or participate normally in society. Many preferred execution to permanent disfigurement that would make normal life impossible. The jury system, where it existed, operated very differently from modern expectations. Jurors were often selected for their knowledge of the accused person rather than their impartiality, and they might be threatened with punishment if their verdict didn't match the authorities' expectations. The concept of impartial judgment by neutral parties was largely foreign to medieval legal thinking. Court procedures were conducted in Latin, which most defendants couldn't understand, making it impossible for them to follow their own trials or respond effectively to accusations. Translation was provided irregularly and often inaccurately, leaving defendants confused about the charges against them and unable to mount effective defences. The language barrier was just another way the legal system disadvantaged ordinary people. Witness testimony was evaluated based on the social status and reputation of the witness rather than the accuracy of their observations. A noble's testimony outweighed that of multiple peasants, while the testimony of known criminals, foreigners, or social outcasts might be rejected entirely regardless of its truthfulness. The legal system reflected and reinforced existing social hierarchies rather than seeking objective truth. Political considerations influenced legal proceedings in ways that were barely concealed. Prisoners accused during periods of political tension might find themselves charged with treason or sedition regardless of their actual activities. Local power struggles often often played out through the legal system, with opposing factions using criminal charges to eliminate rivals or settle scores. Women faced particular disadvantages in medieval legal systems, with their testimony generally considered less reliable than men's and their legal rights severely limited. Married women couldn't represent themselves in court and depended on their husbands or male relatives for legal advocacy. Accusations of witchcraft or sexual impropriety could destroy women's reputations regardless of the evidence, making them particularly vulnerable to false charges. Religious considerations permeated medieval legal proceedings, with oaths sworn on holy relics and appeals to divine judgment common throughout the process. However, religious protection was unevenly applied, with members of minority faiths facing additional suspicion and hostility that affected their chances of receiving fair treatment. The intersection of religious and legal authority created additional complications for defendants, guards and jailers, or new landlords. The people responsible for managing medieval prisons were essentially private contractors who purchased their positions and expected to profit from them, creating a system where prisoner welfare conflicted directly with jailer income. These weren't trained correctional officers with professional standards, but entrepreneurs who saw human misery as a revenue stream and prisoner desperation as market opportunity. Your jailer probably bought his position from whoever held the authority to grant prison management contracts. This might be the local lord, the town council, or royal officials depending on the jurisdiction and type of prison. The position required initial investment but promised substantial returns for those willing to exploit captive customers who couldn't take their business elsewhere. The jailer's business model was simple: extract maximum revenue from prisoners while providing minimum services necessary to keep them alive and prevent riots. Dead prisoners paid no fees, but comfortable prisoners might not pay extra for upgraded services. The optimal strategy involved maintaining conditions bad enough that prisoners would pay for improvements, while stopping short of killing them too quickly. Guard recruitment reflected the jailer's profit margins and the unpleasant nature of the work. Prison guards were typically drawn from the lowest social classes, people desperate enough to work in disease-ridden environments for minimal wages. Some were criminals themselves, working off their own debts or sentences through prison labour. Others were simply brutal individuals who enjoyed having power over helpless people. The daily interactions between guards and prisoners were shaped by corruption, violence, and mutual mistrust. Guards supplemented their low wages by selling overpriced goods to prisoners, accepting bribes for small favours, and stealing from prisoners who couldn't protect their possessions. Prisoners who couldn't pay for protection faced regular abuse, theft, and humiliation from guards who faced no consequences for mistreating them. Sexual assault by guards was common, particularly against female prisoners who had no legal protection and no means of complaint that would be taken seriously. Male prisoners might also face sexual violence from guards who used rape as a form of domination and humiliation. The isolation of prisons and the powerlessness of prisoners created perfect conditions for predatory behaviour by guards. The guard hierarchy within prisons reflected broader social patterns, with head guards wielding significant authority over subordinates and prisoners alike. Competition among guards for better positions and greater opportunities for profit created internal conflicts that prisoners could sometimes exploit, but more often these conflicts resulted in prisoners being caught in the middle of guard disputes and suffering additional abuse. Medical emergencies created additional opportunities for guard exploitation. Guards might demand payment for summoning physicians, for providing clean water to sick prisoners, or for moving seriously ill prisoners to locations where they might recover. The guards' control over basic necessities gave them life and death power over prisoners that was regularly used for financial gain. Escape attempts were viewed by guards as both security threats and business opportunities. Guards who prevented escapes might receive rewards or bonuses, while guards who allowed escapes faced punishment or dismissal. However, guards also accepted bribes to assist escape attempts, creating complex dynamics where the same guard might help or hinder escape plans, depending on the payment involved. The seasonal rhythms of guard behaviour followed economic and social patterns in the broader community. During harvest times, when agricultural wages were high, prisons might have difficulty retaining guards, leading to reduced security but also reduced supervision. During winter months, when employment opportunities were scarce, guard positions became more competitive and guards might work harder to retain their jobs. Violence by guards against prisoners was routine and rarely punished, unless it interfered with the jailer's revenue stream. Guards beat prisoners for disobedience, entertainment, frustration, or simple sadism. The only constraint on guard violence was the jailer's concern that dead or seriously injured prisoners couldn't pay fees, creating a perverse economic incentive for keeping prisoners healthy enough to be profitable. The relationship between guards and families of prisoners was another source of corruption and exploitation. Guards might accept bribes to deliver messages, provide information about prisoners' conditions, or allow extended visits. However, they might also extort money from desperate families by threatening to harm prisoners, or by providing false information about their conditions or legal proceedings. Food distribution provided guards with numerous opportunities for petty corruption and prisoner abuse. Guards might sell the better portions of prison rations to wealthy prisoners while giving spoiled food to those who couldn't pay extra. They might withhold food entirely as punishment for perceived slights, or as leverage to extract payments or favours from prisoners. Communication between prisoners and the outside world was completely controlled by guards who could read letters, prevent delivery of messages, or fabricate communications for their own purposes. Guards might accept bribes to ensure delivery of important correspondence, but they might also blackmail prisoners by threatening to reveal embarrassing or incriminating information contained in their letters. The training and supervision of guards was minimal or non-existent, with new guards learning their duties from more experienced colleagues who passed along both practical knowledge and corrupt practices. There were no professional standards, no oversight from external authorities, and no accountability for guard behaviour beyond the jailer's concerns about maintaining order and profitability. Personal relationships between guards and prisoners sometimes developed, creating additional complexity in an already challenging environment. Guards might develop sympathy for particular prisoners, leading to better treatment or assistance with escape attempts. Conversely, guards might develop personal animosity toward prisoners, leading to targeted harassment and abuse that went beyond the general brutality of prison life. The living conditions of guards were often not much better than those of prisoners, with guards required to spend long hours in the same unhealthy environment that was making prisoners sick. Many guards developed the same diseases and health problems as prisoners, though they had better access to medical care and could leave the prison when off duty. Guard turnover was high due to the unpleasant working conditions, low pay, and health risks associated with prison work. This constant turnover meant that prisoners had to repeatedly establish relationships with new guards, renegotiate protection arrangements, and adapt to different personalities and corruption systems as guard personnel changed. Execution Day, the final horror. For many medieval prisoners, the ultimate destination wasn't release but execution, carried out as public spectacle designed to demonstrate royal justice, deter crime, and provide entertainment for crowds who gathered to watch their fellow humans die in creative and agonizing ways. Execution Day represented both liberation from prison suffering and the final, ultimate horror of medieval justice. The announcement of your execution date would come with little warning and no appeal process. One day the jailer would inform you that your sentence had been confirmed and your execution scheduled for the following morning, noon, or whenever the authorities deemed appropriate for maximum public impact. The news would bring mixed emotions: relief that uncertainty was ending, terror about the manner of death, and despair about life ending just when freedom seemed possible. Preparation for execution involved rituals designed to extract final confessions, demonstrate religious redemption, and satisfy public expectations about proper repentance. Clergy would visit to offer last rites and encourage confession of crimes, both those you were accused of and any others that might cleanse your soul before death. These confession sessions were often used to gather information about other alleged criminals or crimes. The night before execution was traditionally spent in prayer, final meals, and attempts to prepare psychologically for the ordeal ahead. However, the reality was usually less dignified, spending your last hours in the same filthy prison cell with the same diseased cellmates, unable to sleep due to anxiety and unable to eat due to nausea from fear. Some prisoners used their final night to write letters to family members, assuming they were literate and could afford writing materials. The morning of execution began early with preparation rituals that varied by location and method of execution. For hanging, you might be allowed to dress in clean clothes provided by family or charity. For more elaborate executions, special preparations ensured that the spectacle would be sufficiently impressive for the gathered crowd. The goal was to create theatre that would satisfy public demand for justice while demonstrating royal power. The procession to the execution site was designed as public humiliation and final opportunity for confession. You would be paraded through streets lined with spectators who might throw objects, shout abuse, or occasionally offer prayers and sympathy. The route was deliberately planned to pass through areas where maximum crowds could gather and maximum intimidation could be achieved for potential criminals in the audience. The crowd at execution sites was diverse and bloodthirsty, including people from all social classes who viewed public executions as entertainment, moral instruction, and social bonding. Vendors sold food and drink, pickpockets worked the crowds, and festivities accompanied the grim business of judicial murder. The atmosphere resembled a far more than a solemn legal proceeding. The methods of execution varied by crime, social status, and local custom, but all were designed to cause maximum suffering while ensuring eventual death. Hanging was considered relatively merciful. If done correctly, death came from broken necks within minutes. However, many hangings resulted in slow strangulation that could last for half an hour while the victim writhed and struggled for breath. Beheading was reserved for nobles and was considered the most honourable form of execution. A skilled executioner could sever a head with a single blow, resulting in quick death, despite the dramatic appearance. However, inexperienced executioners might require multiple blows, creating extended agony for victims who remained conscious during botched attempts at decapitation. Drawing and quartering was the ultimate punishment for treason, involving hanging until nearly dead, disemboweling while still alive, beheading, and cutting the body into quarters for display. This method guaranteed maximum pain and terror while providing multiple stages of suffering that could be extended or shortened depending on the executioner's skill and the authorities' desire for spectacle. Burning was used for heresy and witchcraft, creating particularly horrific deaths that could last for hours if the fire was built to burn slowly. Victims might be strangled before burning if they recanted their heresies, but unrepentant heretics faced conscious burning that continued until death from shock, smoke inhalation, or finally, burning of vital organs. The role of the executioner was both essential and reviled, creating a social position that combined necessary function with permanent social exclusion. Executioners were typically hereditary positions passed from father to son, as few people would voluntarily enter professions that made them untouchable in normal society. They were well paid but forced to live apart from normal communities. The final moments before execution often involved last words, final prayers, and sometimes pardons that arrived at the last possible moment. These dramatic possibilities added suspense to the proceedings and occasionally provided the happy endings that made execution spectacles even more entertaining for crowds hoping to witness either ultimate justice or miraculous mercy. After execution, bodies were often displayed as continuing warnings to potential criminals. Heads might be placed on spikes at city gates, bodies hung in chains until they decomposed, or corpses left hanging until they fell apart. The post-mortem humiliation served both as deterrent and as demonstration that royal justice extended beyond death itself. The disposal of executed criminals' bodies followed specific protocols designed to deny them proper Christian burial, while maximizing their value as public warnings. Bodies might be buried in unconsecrated ground, thrown into mass graves, or left to rot publicly, depending on the nature of their crimes and local customs regarding the treatment of executed criminals. Family members of executed prisoners faced ongoing social stigma and economic hardship following the execution. They might be denied access to the body for burial, forced to pay fees for disposal of remains, or subjected to continuing suspicion and harassment by authorities and community members. The consequences of execution extended far beyond the individual criminal to affect entire family networks. The psychological impact of witnessing executions was significant for both the crowds who attended and the prisoners who might face similar fates. Children regularly attended executions as educational experiences, learning about justice and morality through observation of extreme violence. The normalization of public execution in medieval society created cultural attitudes toward violence and death that differed dramatically from modern sensibilities. Why you wouldn't survive. The brutal reality. After examining every aspect of medieval imprisonment, from arrest through execution, the conclusion becomes inescapable. You wouldn't survive a day in a medieval prison, and that's probably for the best. The combination of physical hardship, disease, violence, psychological torture, legal injustice, and economic exploitation created a system so comprehensively horrible that death was often preferable to continued survival. The physical environment alone would likely incapacitate most modern people within hours. We're accustomed to climate control, clean water, regular meals, comfortable seating, and basic hygiene that medieval prisons eliminated entirely. The shock of sudden immersion in cold, filthy, overcrowded conditions would overwhelm immune systems already compromised by the stress of arrest and imprisonment. The disease environment was essentially fatal for anyone without natural immunity to tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus, and various bacterial infections that flourished in medieval prisons. Modern medical knowledge would be useless without access to antibiotics, antiseptics, or basic medical supplies. Our understanding of disease transmission might help us avoid some infections, but couldn't protect against the reality of sharing confined spaces with actively ill people. The social dynamics would be equally challenging for people accustomed to personal space, privacy, and voluntary social interaction. The forced intimacy with criminals, the constant threat of violence, and the complex hierarchies based on physical strength and criminal experience would create psychological stress that most contemporary people lack training to handle. Our social skills are adapted for different environments entirely. The economic system would bankrupt most modern families within weeks. The costs of keeping someone alive in medieval prison, while also paying for legal representation, bribes, and basic necessities would quickly exhaust savings accounts that seem substantial in contemporary contexts, but were tiny by medieval standards when converted to the purchasing power needed for prison survival. The legal system would be incomprehensible and terrifying for people accustomed to constitutional protections, due process, and professional legal representation. The arbitrary nature of medieval justice, the assumption of guilt, the use of torture, and the broad application of death penalties would create psychological horror beyond the capacity of most modern people impossible to endure. The psychological challenges would be overwhelming for individuals who have never experienced genuine powerlessness, physical suffering, or existential threat. Our mental health depends on autonomy, hope, social support, and meaningful activity that medieval prisons eliminated entirely. The depression, anxiety, and trauma that would result from medieval imprisonment would likely prove fatal even if physical conditions didn't kill us first. The absence of modern conveniences that we consider basic human needs would create immediate crisis for people who have never lived without them. No electricity, no plumbing, no heating, no cooling, no soft surfaces, no entertainment, no communication technology. The sensory deprivation and physical discomfort would be unbearable for people whose entire existence has been shaped by technological convenience. The moral universe of medieval imprisonment would be incomprehensible for people raised with concepts of human rights, equal justice, and rehabilitation rather than punishment. The casual acceptance of torture, the economic exploitation of prisoners, and the entertainment value of executions would create cognitive dissonance that would be psychologically devastating for anyone with contemporary ethical frameworks. The religious and cultural context would be alien for people who lack the spiritual resources that helped some medieval prisoners endure their circumstances. Without deep religious faith, community support networks, or cultural frameworks that provided meaning for suffering, modern prisoners would lack the psychological tools that enabled some medieval prisoners to survive psychologically even when physical survival was impossible. Perhaps most importantly, the complete absence of hope would be fatal for people accustomed to believing that justice exists, that problems have solutions, and that suffering has meaning. Medieval prisoners faced arbitrary justice, unsolvable problems, and meaningless suffering that would destroy the fundamental optimism required for psychological survival in impossible circumstances. The historical reality of medieval imprisonment represents humanity at its worst, a system that combined ignorance, cruelty, greed, and indifference to human suffering in ways that created maximum misery for minimum social benefit. Understanding this history should make us grateful for modern justice systems despite their flaws, and remind us how easily civilization can collapse into barbarism when institutions prioritize power over people. Your modern life, with all its stresses and inconveniences, provides luxuries that medieval prisoners would have died grateful to experience even briefly. Your worst day in contemporary society, dealing with traffic, deadlines, annoying co-workers, or technological frustrations, contains more comfort, security, and opportunity than the best day any medieval prisoner ever experienced. Your complaints about airline food, slow internet, or uncomfortable furniture would seem like impossible dreams to someone slowly dying in a medieval dungeon. The legal protections you take for granted, the right to remain silent, protection against self-incrimination, access to legal representation, trial by jury, protection against cruel and unusual punishment were developed specifically in response to the horrors of systems like medieval imprisonment. Every constitutional protection, every civil right, every legal safeguard exists because people experienced or witnessed the consequences of unconstrained governmental power and judicial arbitrariness. Your access to medical care, even when you consider it inadequate or expensive, provides health security that would have seemed miraculous to medieval prisoners watching their cellmates die from treatable infections. Your ability to maintain personal hygiene, choose your food, control your environment, and communicate freely represents freedoms that imprisoned medieval people could only dream about during their brief, miserable lives. So the next time you're tempted to romanticize the past or complain about modern inconveniences, remember the medieval prisoners who would have traded their souls for your worst problems. Sleep well in your climate-controlled home with its locked doors, clean water, comfortable bed, and protection by laws that assume your innocence until guilt is proven beyond reasonable doubt. The medieval prisoners who suffered and died in conditions we can barely imagine would envy your worst moments more than their best ones. Sweet dreams, and be grateful that when you wake up tomorrow, you won't be counting down the days until your execution in a system that valued spectacle more than life itself. Your freedom to read this, to learn about history, to form opinions about justice, and to live without constant fear of arbitrary arrest represents the cumulative progress of centuries of people who fought against exactly the kind of system that created medieval prisons. Their suffering and resistance built the world that protects you from experiencing similar horrors, creating a debt to history that we can only repay by remembering their stories and protecting the freedoms they died to secure. Welcome to the modern world, where your biggest legal worries involve parking tickets and tax audits rather than torture chambers and public executions. It's not perfect, but compared to medieval imprisonment, it's the closest thing to paradise that human civilization has ever achieved.